I think you're absolutely right. We have a question in front of us. You've phrased it: do leaders make history, or does history make the leaders? That's one of the first questions I asked the first time I taught the class.
Right.
And I remember it just popped into my mind as a question. Hadn't planned it, just thought of it, and I saw the reaction. It was actually a challenge. People had very strong opinions one way or another, and I think we have a tendency in our culture nowadays to really focus on the individuals and to look at their individual qualities and the trajectory of their lives as the determinant factors in whether they succeed or they fail. And as leaders in particular, whether they were able to master their circumstances, whether they were able to change the world or even change whatever it is, their institution, their company, their community, what have you. So I'm obviously very interested in those things because I examine various leaders and I want to see what it is about them that gives them the qualities or the skills to emerge in the first place as leaders. Is it is it communication? Is it charisma? Is it, there's a whole variety of things that we could go through to see like a checklist, right? But I discover, and I think those who study with me or work with me discover, that it's not just about the individual. It's about the interaction between the individual and the surrounding, in the individual and the historical circumstance, that it often makes the difference between, for example, a great and famous transformative leader and someone that no one today will study or hear of.
Could you give us an example, like a case study on that?
Sure. Well, one case study I can give you is, we were actually chatting about this before, during the Great Depression of the 1930s, which I think, people have heard of the Great Depression. They might know about the Great Depression, but I don't think people realize just quite how bad the Great Depression was. It wasn't just like an economic crisis of, there's our credit rating has been downgraded or something.
Yeah, it's not like nowadays where the central bank always helps. But
there's no bailing out. There's no, This is a situation where where first nationally and then globally, there is a true economic freefall. And when I say freefall, it means that people lose everything. And a society goes into a spiral of decline. Now, when that happens, and you find yourself with things like 25 to 30% unemployment, just imagine what that is in a modern society, modern, advanced, industrial, Western society, for example. What kind of political and social fallout there would be from that? What it is like to experience such fear and crisis. So we know, for example, that in Europe at the time, the continent basically went in the direction of dictatorships. We know that there is a direct lead-in. Everybody has heard of Hitler and everybody has heard of the Nazis. They come to power in Germany as a direct result of economic freefall and runaway inflation having to do with the depression. So it's a global crisis that has severe political ramifications. And in the United States, which is the origin of this crisis, at the time there was, when the crisis hits, the president is Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover was considered to be a brilliant man. He had never held any public office. He was elected president in 1928 on the basis of what people considered to be just extraordinary abilities as a public servant, as a businessman, as an entrepreneur, who had pulled himself up by his bootstraps, as they say. He was a great manager. But when crisis hit, he turned out to be the wrong man at the wrong place at the wrong time. And it's not because he was an innately poor leader. It's just that for that situation, he turned out to be not the right kind of leader that a society needs. Instead, the subsequent president, who was elected in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt, who actually didn't have the same reputation coming in. He wasn't as highly regarded as Herbert Hoover had been, turned out to be the right kind of leader for a crisis, partly because of his confidence, partly because of his dynamism in creating policies that responded to a crisis. His ability to communicate with the people, with the public, was shown through at that time. And he was a fighter. I mean, he really turned out to be a fighter, which people didn't necessarily expect him to be. Now, if you had switched the situation between Roosevelt and Hoover and put Roosevelt in the time of peace, Hoover at the time of the Depression, then you might get the opposite effect.
Right.
I think that what you see in that case is that Franklin Roosevelt was the right kind of leader for a severe crisis. He might not have been the right kind of leader for a more stable situation, for a more peacetime situation. Whereas I think Hoover was the right kind of leader for a more managerial situation, where you're really trying to kind of stay the course. You know, the situation is stable, and you want to do well on that basis. And he was the right kind of person, but he was very popular before the crisis. And the crisis hits, and that completely changes. So this is an example of two leaders that I don't even want to say, well, one was great and the other was not. But I want to point out that the way that we remember them as transformative, or in one case as Roosevelt and the other not so, really has to do with the circumstances in which they operated, and not only with innate qualities and individualism, which I think are important. But I also think, as a general comment, I mean, we have to keep in mind, and it's hard, you know, people find it sometimes a difficult message to swallow because we are so proud of ourselves. You know, we accomplish things, right, with our two hands, and no one helps us, and we do it on our own, and we struggle, and it's all we are in a very individualistic society. And I'm just as, you know, guilty of it as anyone else.
Sure.
But it's very important to remember that we are also part of a world. We're part of a community wherever we are. We have friends and associates, we have family. We have schools that we go to. We have people that we know. We have institutions that we belong to. We have things that are happening around us all the time that we interact with. So we are part of a society, and we're part of collective groups of people. And often the way that we interact with these institutions and society and these collectives and other people is just as important, if not more important, than any innate qualities that we're born with, or that, you know, we somehow find inside ourselves over time. I don't want to denigrate that. That's important, but it's not the only thing.